All right. Well, I do want to cover two of his, the two minor problems that he has up, primarily because I feel like it kind of shows the way that Kip has, I guess, approached this particular topic of your book in particular. I think it kind of highlights a little bit of his methodology for it, for going through it and everything and attacking it. So this first part is element 2 of on the historicity of Jesus that he apparently has a minor problem with.
I do want to key in on a couple of these elements to pick at some minor, but I think important things. For element 2, Carrier says, when Christianity began, Judaism was highly sectarian and diverse. There was no normative set of Jewish beliefs, but a countless array of different Jewish belief systems vying for popularity. This is true. There's a lot that we don't know about the shape and the form of early Judaism, and we certainly do know of a number of competing Jewish sects. But I do have a small problem here where at one point Carrier speaks of at least 10 competing or possibly more than 30 of these Jewish sects. Even just a brief summary of who these sects are or what they believe and how we know of them would have been extremely helpful. Even more important, does any one of them come close to approximating something like Carrier's minimal mythicism? Unfortunately, he never says so.
That's his issue with element 2, and then he goes into element 3. But I did want to the way that I kind of approached Kip's video was, I've got your book in ebook form, and it's where I can look at it on the computer. And then, I've also got Kip's video. And so I'm listening to Kip's video, and then I go to element 2 that he has this problem with.
Yeah.
And, I'm checking it, and just so that everybody can sort of see, let's see, stop sharing that screen, and then we'll present a different screen. So here's element 2. Just so that everybody can see. Now, I've highlighted the portion there that has the footnote attached to it, which is footnote 14 in this section.
It's a long note.
Yeah, and then you go over, and it's very top, for a summary of the evidence and sources collectively establishing this element. So this is a footnote that establishes element 2 as being like an established scholarly, like a scholarly established fact.
Yeah, and it's citing this book, which was published in 2005. I have 3 chapters in it. It was edited by Price and Lauder. So Robert Price and Jeff Lauder edited this volume. It has a lot of really great chapters in it, but it has 3 by me, and 1 is on specifically the longest chapter on issues related to this, on the nature of the resurrection body. And it just so happens that it's relevant to the debate about the nature of the resurrection body, that there were so many disputes amongst different sects among the Jews as to what the resurrection would be like. And so there was at the time, and still is, a lot of Christian apologetics about, well, the Jews only had one idea of a Messiah, only one idea of a resurrection, and Christianity fits it, etc. And so what I point out is that no, there was tons of debate and disagreement among Jews about all of these things. And a lot of when Kip mentions, is a lot of stuff we don't know. And I think he's already kind of looking at this chapter as if I'm already presenting evidence for minimal mythicism, which I'm not doing. What I'm doing is I'm forestalling some common apologetics, one of which is the Jews would never say that, the Jews would never think that. That's a Christian apologetic, happens all the time. I'm sure Davis probably does it on occasion. That's a fallacious statement because you don't know that's true, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's so many sects that we know only the name of, and we know they hated each other, and we know they disagreed with each other, but we don't know what they thought. So you can't say that none of them thought a certain thing, right? So you can't make arguments like that. What you can say is that we have no evidence for this particular belief among the Jews, but that doesn't mean they didn't have it, right? So it's all about attenuating the probabilities of what they're talking about. They want the probability to be 0 if we have no evidence for it that they didn't exist. It might be low, but it's not going to be 0 because we know there's this diversity. And the diversity means that we can no longer say things like the Jews only believed a certain thing. It's not the case. And Kip, he admits this right at the top of his complaint there. He seems to have some other issue with this. I'm surprised that he doesn't know the 10 to 30 sects. Because in this, what I do is I actually have, I don't know if this isn't going to come across way at all. It's the Heady Days of Jewish Diversity. I think that's right. Yeah. Where I go into it item by item, and everything is just standard references, right, in the field of Jewish studies, right? Like I'm not making any of this up, right? I'm getting it all from scholarship, and I'm just relating what the scholarship says, right? I'm not inventing this. Right. And the question, the dispute, whether it's 10 or 30, depends on how much of these sects are the same sect. So we might have like 15 names of sects, but are some of those names of the same sect, right? Like there's questions like that. And then there's questions about, for instance, we know there was something like 6 different sects of the Essenes. Like the Essenes themselves were fragmented into 6 warring factions that had different beliefs on things. And that's just the 6 we know about because they're referenced. We don't know what they're called, but we know that they exist because we have sources that talk about them and talk about some of their differences and things, but only some of their differences. We don't know the whole list of what they thought. And so anyway, that's what the element is about. The element is only about, look, for all our probability estimates here going forward, you have to accept that there's diversity and disagreement among Jews. You can't talk about normative Judaism as if it's an argument anymore. Like it's not, it has some relevance to what's probable or likely, but not the relevance that usually the apologetic tries to force on people. And that's the whole point of this. It's not trying to prove that there was a pre-Christian Jewish sect that believed in a mythical Christ. Like that's not going on here at all.
Yeah. And I was actually going to ask you, like, it seems like, that's what Kip was kind of like really wanting. And I've heard this from plenty of other people, like, do you have evidence that there was like a sect of Jews that believed in this celestial dying Christ type of person? And it always kind of gets me because it's like we don't necessarily need to have like direct evidence of it.
It's all indirect. It's all circumstantial because all the evidence that we would want is gone. It wasn't preserved. So, and this relates to this element too. Like when Kip says, like, there's so much we don't know about the Jews and their different sects. That's because no one preserved this information, right? So we've lost like 90 to 95% of the knowledge we would need to know to make normative statements about what all Jews thought or what some Jews could have thought or whatever. So we can only work indirectly. We have to build evidence, like circumstantial evidence, to establish whether a sect or not would believe something or not. And so that's a complex process, et cetera. That's what scholarship is for. But all of that is back in play now, because now that we know that there was huge diversity and we don't know about all of it, there's so much we don't know, and that's relevant, what we don't know.
Do you think the diversity is somewhat comparable to the diversity in Christianity now, like with the different denominations and offshoots and everything?
Quantitatively, no, because Christianity is so much huger. I mean, we're 6 billion people now, and we're talking about maybe 1 million Jews back then, right? Like it's a massive difference in people. The sectarian, it's also more thousands of years of sectarian schisming. So I would say there's vastly more sects of Christianity. I think someone estimated it's in the tens of thousands of sects of Christianity. Yeah, vastly more. And Judaism, like I said, it's like 10 to 30, maybe a little more than 30. Is the order of magnitude that we're dealing with in terms of sectarian diversity.
Okay. So now this next part is still minor problems, but dealing with element 3 that he apparently has a minor problem with.
This brings me to element 3. He says, when Christianity began, many Jews had long been expecting a Messiah, a divinely chosen leader or savior, anointed, literally or figuratively christened, hence a Christ, to help usher in God's supernatural kingdom. So a little later on in the paragraph, Carrier goes on to describe that this belief could be in a purely spiritualized deliverance of Jews from their enemies. I have to ask at the outset, is there any kind of evidence of Jewish belief in this exclusive feature? I agree that this can be a part of certain elements of Jewish messianic expectation, but as far as I can tell, virtually all of them are still completely grounded in this view of tangible, real world enemies. Jews, as far as we can tell on the basis of all the literature that has been provided, were anticipating an actual deliverance from the actual Romans.
So the issue that I have with this particular section is this idea that all the evidence that we have only points towards the Jews expecting deliverance directly from the Romans. And there's not any evidence whatsoever of like spiritual or celestial or anything of that nature, I guess, being expected by the Jews.
I just checked this. And I forgot to check this when I did my article. And when I wrote my article, my response was that, well, that's in chapter 5. So this proves to me that he hasn't read the book, right? He's
Right.
doing videos he's doing it on the fly. So he's only gotten to element 10 of chapter 4. He doesn't know what's in the rest of the book. That was my argument. I realized I thought it would be weird if I didn't mention that in the book. And so I just now brought up the book and I'm looking at it, and he's talking about the way would have been open. These are my words in the book. The way would have been open to imagine a messianic victory over Israel's enemies that could only be perceived spiritually, parentheses, see element 28.
Yeah.
So when he says, I'd like to see some like evidence or discussion of this, it says, go to element 28. This is the kind of stuff that it really like is vexing and it's frustrating to me. Like he acts like I didn't tell him where to go. Like it's there in the text, literally at the end of the sentence that he's talking about. He says, well, I would kind of like to see a discussion of this. Yeah. That's why it says to go to element 28. That's where the discussion is. And element 28 actually picks up on elements 23 through 29. So element 28, element 28 by itself isn't even the whole answer. Like I build to it through multiple elements in chapter 5. So if you'd read chapter 5, you would know where I'm coming from. But notice all I say is that the way would be open. I don't say that there were already sects doing this. Like I'm very clear. Like I'm not hoodwinking anybody. I say exactly what I mean. So, yeah.
Well, I also find it kind of weird that he, in both of these elements, it seems like Kip is, I don't know if it's purposefully missing the footnotes or the in-text side are pointing towards other elements. But I mean, it's very clear, like you have a footnote and it goes to like an entire list of like scholars there that seem to support this point. And I do my due diligence on these things and I like try to find like the references that you cite. And every time I look, it's like, oh, he says this says this. Oh, look, that says that. And so like it's weird to me how people can, be like, oh, he doesn't provide proof for this. Did you check the footnotes?
Yeah.
Did you then look at the actual stuff that he cites?
What you're catching is that he's skimming in bad faith, which is the opposite of being objective. Like if you're a scholar, you're taught to be objective. You're taught specifically to not skim things in bad faith. Like that is one of the things that they try to beat out of you in graduate school that's what internet randos do. That is not what scholars do. And yet, and I'm sure he doesn't do this anywhere else. It's just only when it's my book does he do this. He rage skims. He doesn't read it carefully. He's deliberately trying to find errors rather than trying to like understand where I'm coming from. You know what I mean? So he's not doing this the way a scholar would normally do it. And I don't think it's because he's bad at scholarship. I think it's just because he has some sort of emotional issue with me. Well, and also I should mention on that sentence that he did gloss over the fact that here's the whole sentence. We can reasonably infer that if the enemies that needed to be defeated were ever considered to be invisible demons rather than the actual Roman legions, for example, the way would have been open to imagine a messianic victory over Israel's enemies that could only be perceived spiritually. So he leaves that bit out. I think that's important that he leaves that out because when you read the epistles, that's all Paul's about, man. It's invisible enemies. We got to conquer these fucking demons. Like, he's like, yeah, pay your taxes. The Romans aren't the problem. It's the fucking demons, right? It's the demons we need to be saved from. It's the demons we need to fight. It's the demons we need to put armor on to defend ourselves against, right? Like all his war metaphors about fighting demons, right? That's all about the spiritual powers they're evil spiritual powers that they have to overcome. So there's no doubt that this is what Christians believed. Now, imagine that they come from a sect of Jews that believes this. It's easy to see then for that sect that they're less concerned about a Messiah defeating the Roman legions. They're more concerned about a Messiah defeating Satan and the demons and death, right? Like they're more concerned about the spiritual victory than the military one. And you see that all throughout Paul's letters, is that he's way more interested in the spiritual victory than in the military one. He has no interest in the military victory. And so there's two ways you could explain this. I mean, one is that this was already an approach that, some Jews were trying. Another way is that this is an approach that was ripe for some Jew to figure out that this is an obvious move. And that's what I talk about in Element 28. And another way to think about it is that just for some weird reason, Christians went completely off book and came up with this completely bizarre system of beliefs with no precedent or context, right? And in a sense, that's the position that Davis is unwittingly defending. He's defending the least probable of the three explanations of the contents of the epistles, and that's what my elements are aimed to point out. Is that like that doesn't make any sense, right? Like this stuff came from somewhere. All this obsession with demons and spiritual victories, that came from somewhere. It wasn't just spontaneously invented. And you could, historicists would say, well, the defeat of Jesus, the death of Jesus was so catastrophic that it caused his Jewish sect to just completely flip Judaism upside down and completely rethink everything. And it caused all of this transformation. It's like, that's possible, but isn't it more likely that they're using material that's already around, right? Like they're using ideas that are already in the air. Demons are already a thing. Spiritual victories are already kind of like an available concept. And this is what it's all about, probabilities, right? Well, what is more likely given what we know? And that's what I'm getting into. So, and that's why it's clear that it's important that I'm very clear that I don't say that I've found this. I'm just saying that given all of these specific details that we know, these inferences are reasonable, right? That's it. Like it would be easy for a Jewish thinker to find this out, to figure this out, to come up with this idea, given this context. So it's not a bizarre, out of the blue, strange thing. Christianity. It isn't. There's nothing strange or bizarre about Christianity, except for its conjunction of features. But each individual feature comes from somewhere. They borrowed it from somewhere, whether it's Judaism or something else, right? So, which sect they might borrow from different sects of Judaism, for example. So the religion itself is bizarre, but most of the specific things that you think are bizarre, though they were already there, they come from somewhere. And so this wasn't some sort of huge radical, a million different factual changes in the way Jews think about things. So it was maybe a few changes in the way they thought about things, but not this whole complex of beliefs, not this whole belief system. It had to have been there already in some form, however much they transformed it. And that's a digression. There's many, that talks about many other elements that Kip doesn't get into. So we can move on from there, I guess, but.
Okay. I do want to remind everybody in the chat, I do see a few people doing super chats. If you want to ask Dr. Carrier some questions, definitely send in a super chat, and ask your question, and that's the way to guarantee that your question will be asked. I'm not paying so much attention right now to the chat, but we will be going through super chats. So if you want a question answered, like anything that we're talking about tonight, definitely send in a super chat so that you can definitely get an answer. Before we move on to the next part, the thing that really kind of, I guess, caught my attention there at the end was him specifically saying that we only have, like, the Jews were only concerned with defeating the Romans. And I'm not claiming to know a lot about, like extra biblical, like Jewish texts and everything. But I feel like the amount of extra biblical Jewish texts that we have show that the Jews were not only focused on like earthly, like enemies and like earthly things of that nature. I mean, even in the Old Testament, you have the Jews concerned with a lot of like what we would consider supernatural sort of things.
Absolutely true.
Yeah. So that's kind of what caught my attention there. I was like, wait a second, that doesn't sound right. But